Everyone, we need to take a few minutes to talk about the difference between standard deviation and standard error. These are two similar measurements that mean really different things and they're easy to get confused. So let's take a few minutes and try and clear up that confusion. A standard deviation is a measure of the variability within a sample, whereas the standard error is the sampling error of an estimate. Now that all probably sounds like gobbledygook and it's really hard to understand, but we're going to break it down for you bit by bit. We've already talked about the variability within a sample being measured as the standard deviation. So the standard deviation takes all of the measurements within a sample and simply represents those as a number that represents the average deviation of each observation from the sample mean. So this is calculated directly from the sample and represents variability in observations within a statistical sample. But the problem is that samples don't perfectly reflect the population. They're our best estimate, but they're never going to be a perfect representation of our population. And that's because they're just a sample. So each time we go out and collect a new sample, we're going to get a slightly different estimate of the mean. So this was our original estimate, which had a sample mean of 6. If we went out and did this a bunch more times from the same population, we might get a slightly different sample mean for each time we do this. And so we can depict these in a frequency histogram. Here are these 5 observations where we had 2 observations with a sample mean of 6, some with 5, some with 6 point something, a little bit higher. If we were to do this 1,000 times, this is what we would get. Each time we would get a slightly different sample mean. Most of the time they'd come out in and around 6, but sometimes we'd get a sample mean over 10 or even less than 2. So what's clear is that each time we sample, we're going to get a different estimate of the mean. The standard error is simply a measure of how different each of those estimates are from one another across samples. So here on the left, we've got our distribution of estimates from each of 1,000 samples. The standard error then is simply a measure of variability in these estimates. And more precisely, it's the standard deviation of these sampling estimates. So the standard deviation of the sample then represents variability among observations within a single sample, whereas the standard error of the mean provides a measure of how different those estimates of the mean are likely to be across a bunch of samples. But wait a minute, no one's going to go out and sample a population thousands of times to calculate a standard error. So how can we deal with this? What can we do? But luckily for us, we can calculate the standard error using information from a single sample alone. This is almost kind of magical that we can do this. Well, how can we do this? As it turns out, we can measure the standard error of the mean simply as the standard deviation of the sample divided by the square root of n. So our standard error of the mean provides us with a measure of the precision of our estimate, or how much that estimate is likely to vary from sample to sample if we were to collect lots of samples. But we can calculate it directly from a single sample using the standard deviation of that sample divided by the square root of n. The standard error then is going to be smaller the larger our sample size is. The standard error will also be smaller if the standard deviation of our sample is smaller. In the extreme case where our sample has no variation at all, then it doesn't matter how many times we go out and resample, we're always going to get the same estimate of the mean because the observations don't vary. So when should I use standard deviation and when should I use standard error? Well, first of all, standard deviation is what provides us with a description of variability, either within our particular sample or in our population. So if you care about variability, then report standard deviation. The standard error of the mean, on the other hand, gives us a measure of the precision of our estimate. We have an estimate of a mean. How precise an estimate is that? How confident are we in that estimate? So when you care about the mean value and its precision, then use the standard error of the mean rather than the standard deviation. So I hope this short video then helped to clear up the difference between the standard deviation of a sample and the standard error of the mean.